Benjamin Franklin, I believe, said something to the effect of, if I could have a government without a newspaper without a government, I would pick the newspaper. And the reason is, and of course he was talking about an independent, high-quality fourth estate that creates an information commons. Information commons or epistemic commons is an important concept that I think everybody needs to have, which is, when we think of the commons, we think about some shared aspect of the world that is both a resource that we have shared access to, but also some shared stewardship of. We don't have very good commons management today in lots of ways, and we can see tragedy of the commons type dynamics because of that. But we think of the air as an example of a commons, or the ocean, or whatever. Well, the information commons is what is the space of information out there about what is true that informs our capacity to make choices. And we can see that just like a smokestack billowing pollution into the air, most of what is being put into the information commons is pollution, right? It's a lot of noise and not true stuff, or stuff that is partially true with spin to advance some agentic interests. Because most interests, when they're communicating, are communicating to get people to believe something that is useful for them. And particularly the more powerful they are, they use that asymmetric power to both maintain and increase their asymmetric power. We can see that since COVID, like the markets crashed and then they've bounced back up, but employment hasn't correspondingly gone back up. Real production in the underlying market and real wealth of the people relative to their purchasing power hasn't gone up. A few billionaires' wealth has, radically gone up. So we see the both radical power asymmetry represented in finance, and the decoupling of the actual, economy and the market. So the information commons is the thing we're talking about here. And in some ways, I would say the information commons is more important than the other ones to pay attention to, because it's the basis of why any of us would make the choices we would that would determine how we affect the air or the ocean or war or anything else. And so I would say the quality of the information commons is requisite. And that is both like the quality of public education and the quality of media, news. And you can see in all the kind of founding documents for this country, those were both considered prerequisites for the ongoing protection of the republic. That there would be very high quality public education where everyone learned the civics necessary to really participate, and a independent high quality fourth estate so people could know what was going on currently so they could participate meaningfully and effectively. And we know that institutions decay for a number of reasons, and we've seen radical decay in the fourth estate and in public education and in kind of government writ large as a result. It's also important to understand that it's not just that democracies and republics require high quality information, even markets do. If you read Ayn Rand and other kind of laissez-faire market ideology, it talks about the need for accurate and symmetrical information for the rational actors to be able to make good choices in the market, right? The idea that a rational actor can see all of the information and make a good choice, and as a result, the best products and services at the best price are what get upregulated. Well, if I can't see all the things because there's way too many of them, and so then the algorithms that determine what I see end up affecting my choice. And if I'm not actually a rational actor doing really good sense making that has the info to compare what a better product or service is, whoever does better marketing that emotionally compels me ends up winning rather than better product and service. So the system starts to incent extraction over real production value. So all of our large systems of coordination, whether they're more state-like systems or market-like systems, require accurate and symmetrical information for people to make good choices. So if we think about how have humans ever thought about coordinating at scale? There's a bunch of models that different social scientists have put together. I'll share one, but there's different ways of thinking about it, so we don't need to attach too hard, but you'll kind of get the gist. There are market-type mechanisms for large-scale coordination. There are government or state-like mechanisms, and there are culture-like mechanisms. And we can kind of define all those differently, but market-type mechanisms mean some kind of distributed bottom-up type system where the agreement happens point to point, not as a systemic agreement across the whole space, and the topology is emergent. And whether it is a formal religious organization or a state or some kind of commons agreement, then you have the government type mechanisms that have some top-down collective agreement type structure. Those are kind of different architectures. But then you have like culture, and by culture here, because that word means different things in different places, I mean, what are the collective values that people hold and the collective worldview and ways of making sense that would determine, say, in a government, what laws should be made, right? Because law is really a codification of an ethical system. Ethics is then not part of the market or part of the state formally, but is supposed to be guiding and binding them. And so we can think of that as kind of like a culture. And so if you think about those three and how they're supposed to interact, in the idea of like our current system, a liberal democracy of some sort, roughly, is that most of the innovation will happen and most of the exchange of goods and services and the kind of flow of resource and resource allocation will happen in the market. But the reason that we have a liberal democracy that has a state as opposed to just a pure market, and many people will talk about this reason differently, but like the kind of foundational reason that is argued for is that markets will have a market for human trafficking or for organ harvesting or for organized crime or maybe to cut all the wood in an area down and there's no state park left or whatever it is. So there can be perverse incentives in markets that are good in the short term but really bad in the long term, or good for some people, bad for others. And so we say, okay, there are some things, market does innovation and production well, but it also does extraction and kind of pathological stuff. So we want to bind the predatory aspects of market. Well, how do we do that? Well, we'll make a state and we'll give it this thing called rule of law. And then we'll give it this thing called monopoly of violence, which is the police force internally that can, so we make a national forest, right? So we're not going to cut down the trees here. We can cut down the trees here, but not here. And then if someone goes and is cutting the trees down there, the cops are going to show up. And if those guys have guns, the cops have bigger guns. The monopoly of violence, because without enforcement, law doesn't really mean anything, right? It's just kind of a suggestion. And then incentive is still going to be the thing that runs it. So this is a system that supposedly, rather than based on incentive, can bind predatory incentive. So the purpose of the state primarily is to check the predatory aspects of market, where people would have an incentive to do something that we kind of collectively want to agree is not a thing to do. But then the people are supposed to bind and check the state. That's the idea of governance of, for, and by the people, is how do we ensure that the market interests, where the money and the power is, don't just capture the regulatory interests and say, hey, change this thing in my benefit and your Swiss bank account will get filled up and you'll have a house to use in the Hamptons and whatever else. Well, the only way to ensure that you don't get regulatory capture is if there's enough transparency in government and the people are educated enough and actively involved that they get to see that the government is actually doing rule of law rather than other things. Think about how far the citizens here, or pretty much anywhere, are from being able to understand the issues that are happening at the level of federal government and actually have transparent insight and are actively involved in a way that would kind of police the thing. So of course then what happens is you do get regulatory capture, because as the people aren't checking the state stops checking the market, the predatory aspects of the market starts to follow a power law distribution, and those who have the most resources, who have asymmetric power, have both the capacity and the incentive to increase their asymmetric power. And that's through a bunch of things. It's through marketing and affecting the mindsets of the people. It's through affecting news and media. It's through the capture of regulatory systems, all of those different types of dynamics. And the last part of this system, so the state checks the market, the people check the state, then the market or the underlying economy itself checks the people, which means that the thing that the people want, the accounting actually has to work. They can't all want to extract more from the system than anyone is putting in. If you really think about that, there's actually a beautiful and kind of stabilizing complex geometry to it. But at the base of it is the capacity of the people as a whole to make good choices. And whether it's how they're acting in the market, how they're acting in the state, checking it, if people can't make sense of the types of issues that the world is facing and that the states will be making choices on and that the markets are affecting, if they can't make sense of that well and they can't communicate about it well, all of those systems start to be captured.